Have you ever thought of governing as a game? We tend to think of governing as a cooperative enterprise where citizens join together to manage their community. But as communities struggle to engage citizens in such an overwhelming and distracting modern world, a little dose of the competitive spirit of games can bring up the best of everyone. I'll give you two examples. In 2017, the municipality of Santa Monica re-engaged citizens in urban planning with a clever idea. They came up with a Tinder-style app named CitySwipe. Traditional consultation methods in Santa Monica hadn't succeeded in attracting people feedback. Citizens' assemblies were deserted or dominated by the very few who had the time or the will to participate. Neither online nor offline consultations had gathered any significant feedback. Results were timely procedures, expensive procedures, and low participation and rising discontent. In fact, communities started to engage only when it was too late, via discontent, and the project were already about to be realized. But the Tinder-style app, CitySwipe, managed to re-engage citizens in small parts of urban planning. In a typical CitySwipe experience, residents are shown a picture of folding cafe tables and then pink park benches and asked, which one do you prefer? After that, they're shown a picture of a rock concert in the city center and a community barbecue and asked again, which one would you like? Drawing from the Tinder experience of swiping left and right, the CitySwipe app managed to re-engage the community into small parts of community engagement. It was fun, easy to use, and immediate. Could we have even more fun with such an app? Wouldn't it be nice if we could swipe left or right on our politicians? Another institution that exemplifies very well the disconnection between civil society and public sector is the World Bank. The World Bank employs thousands and commits billions yearly in financing and commitments and guarantees, and yet it is ignored by the many and distrusted by the most. In 2007, the World Bank invented a serious game called Evoke. Evoke is a graphic novel. Players step into the role of the members of the Evoke network, a network composed of the best scientists and thinkers in the world. They are challenged with real issues of cooperation for development. Each week, a new mission was uploaded on the Evoke platform, and players had to brainstorm from all over the world and progress through the three phases of the game: ideation, action, and imagination. Possible rewards included a trip to Washington, D.C., where the best ideas were evaluated and possibly implemented by the World Bank officials. Evoke remains the gold standard in gamified governance. According to the World Bank, in its initial run, it drew 100,000 visitors from 150 countries. So, you see, game design elements like badges, points, rankings, levels, challengings are increasingly used by governments everywhere. What we could label simplistically as play is quickly becoming the way that we interact with policymakers at the domestic and supranational levels. With games, governments are more enjoyable and citizens are more willing to participate. Who wouldn't like to have an opportunity to impact on policy making and doing so in a non-boring and dynamic way? Now, you might think that this is a very contemporary phenomenon, and it is. But actually, the use of games has been part of human history since ever. Politicians, those in search of power, public institutions have used games to harness the energy of people or sometimes to distract. In ancient Rome, it was a common use to provide free bread and circus games to the poorer as a means to gain political power. The Roman poet Juvenal described this practice as panem et circenses, literally, bread and circuses. Flash forward to 1795. Napoleon is facing the problem of feeding his troops while invading countries in countries that could not provide food for the troops. So he offers 12,000 francs to the first who could reinvent a method for preserving food. Well, it would take 15 years, but eventually the prize went to the confectioner François Appert, who invented a method for preserving food that we still use today by boiling and sealing food in airtight glass. The use of games is what we should be looking as the future. And there are three main trends that are driving the use of games in governments. What makes the difference in the use of games in contemporary governance, it's that for the first time in human history, governments are looking at the behavioral and motivational effects of games. So the first trend is technology. We are all aware of the pervasiveness of technology in our daily lives. But sometimes we do not consider the impact that technology is having on the exercise of public power. In less than a century, technology has changed forever the way that governments operate and interact with citizens. It is because of technology that governments have shifted away from what New York University professor Beth Novak names the myth of the spectator citizen. This is the belief that only professional civil servants possess the right skill to govern. A second reason that is driving the use of games in governments is the fact that technology is making audiences more demanding. We expect from our governments to respond as quickly as our mobile phones when we ask for information or a public service. So, in the eyes of a public regulator, using fun design element, it's a way to engage large audiences while maintaining a high level of trust in public institutions. A third reason is related with costs. The global crisis which erupted in 2018 has left the world into a seemingly endless age of uncertainty. And we are all aware of the effects of this on our daily lives. But again, sometimes we neglect the way that this has affected public powers. With budgetary pressures and public sector capacity at its historic low, governments are changing forever the receipts for governing. And this is why we are replacing with innovative tools, outdated and resource-intensive models. Just please be aware, innovating policymaking does not come for free. Depending on the complexity of the issue, you can have significant costs in sampling, ideating, and attracting the right experts. Just to give you an example, a Vogue from the World Bank cost $500,000 to the World Bank. I see the future of governing as increasingly gamified, and in particular, I see two broad scenarios ahead of us. In my last book, Games, Powers, and Democracies, I named the first scenario the Western model of gamified governance. This is my preferred model, and yet it is not a model free from risks. A first risk is related with incentives. To what extent is a government legitimized to nudge citizens with fun design elements? It might be argued that the higher are the incentives, the less is the willingness for citizens to respond to these incentives. It happened already. When the municipality of Stockholm introduced the speed camera lottery to reward with cash prizes those drivers that were driving within the speed limit, the average speed dropped from 32 kilometers per hour to 25 kilometers per hour. Pretty cool, right? But unfortunately, the experiment had to be suspended when they realized that some drivers had started to drive around the cameras to increase the likelihood to receive a prize. A second risk is related with inclusion. In a world in which we are increasingly connected with technologies, biases in having the right technologies may limit the participation only to those that have access to technologies while leaving the others outside in the cold. Some scholars describe this phenomenon as digital divide. And the typical victims of digital divide are people aged over 65 or people with a low income. But even if you have access to high-speed internet, does not mean that you are not at risk of exclusion. There are certain communities, I'm thinking about the LGBTQ community or indigenous people, which are constantly underrepresented or excluded by online social and political discourses. A third risk of the Western model is privacy. Let us admit it. The use of gamified governance, as for any other tool of digital governance, is privacy intrusive. So again, we might expect that the more the governments are becoming sophisticated in using such nudges, the more data they will demand from citizens. And at this point, I guess, you might think that the Western model is too problematic and should be abandoned. Well, you might want to reconsider. I named the second model the Black Mirror model because it mirrors, pun intended, one of the most successful episodes of the award-winning British show. In this episode, titled Nosedive, we meet Lizzie. Lizzie is a woman obsessed with her social credit score. And in a world in which people rate each other on a 1 to 5 star scale, having a good rating is essential to have a good life. Well, Lacey's efforts have disastrous consequences. She finds herself incapable to book a flight, rent a car, and eventually attending a wedding. There is a region in the world in which the Black Mirror model is currently tried out, and it looks not different from what we saw on our screens. Not only personal data, but also the behavior of Chinese citizens is currently recorded, stored, and turned into grades by Chinese authorities. So you can be a grade A citizen. In this case, you will have prioritarian access to social services. But you can be a grade D citizen. In this case, you can be denied licenses, permits, and even access to social services. And believe me, it's pretty easy to perform poorly in the Black Mirror model. You can be late with paying your bills, for example. Or you can spend too much time watching TV or Netflix. Or you can share false information online. So now, take a second to think about yourself. How close would you be to a C or a D type of citizen in such a model? We started by thinking about governing as a game. But the more we've been delving into gamified governance, the easier it is to understand that this is like opening Pandora's box. What we find is both encouraging and deeply concerning. Gamified governance has the power to foster civic engagement, score 1 for gamified policymaking. But it comes at significant costs in terms of privacy and inclusion, -1 for gamified policymaking. With game design elements, governments can trigger the interest of citizens in participating, yet it can have detrimental effects on the individual motivations. So you see, we are back where we started, between being fascinated or terrified by this attempt to instill playfulness into our relationship with governments. In such a stalemate, the supercomputer Whopper from the 1983 movie War Games, the computer that was programmed to predict the outcomes of a nuclear war, would probably suggest that the only winning move is not to play. I'd rather take a pragmatic approach. I recognize that gamification alone is not a game changer. However, with the use of the right policy tools, it can help governments to achieve concrete results in our democratic systems. After all, everywhere in the world, from the smallest administration to a global institution like the World Bank, public regulators are struggling to re-engage with citizens. What gamification offers, for those who are willing to consider it, are playful solutions to serious problems. Thank you.